Unlabeled leadership is a volunteer service. We appreciate our guests for their stewardship and remarkable stories. We also appreciate listeners like you who back the show with star reviews and contributions.
Gary DePaul with Unlabeled Leadership. Welcome to episode 159. Rusty Gaillard helps you reframe to succeed. Here's a shout out to listeners in Long An, Vietnam, Eastern Cape, South Africa, and in the United States, Bellevue, Washington, Kennett Square, Pennsylvania, Marion, Ohio, and White Plains, New York. With that, let's get started. Rusty has had more than 20 years of corporate experience. He's worked for Apple, PG&E, and GE, but now Rusty is a keynote speaker, executive and career coach, and is the author of the book, Breaking the Code, Stop Looking for Answers and Start Enjoying Life. To give you an idea what it's like to work with Rusty, I wanted to read for you one of the recommendations on Rusty's LinkedIn profile. Here it is. Rusty is a trusted thought partner who helped me get clear on what I really want and make the decisions to achieve it. His approach of getting to the foundational layer of my life and learning style was like rocket fuel for achieving my goals as I embraced the principle that the only thing that I needed to change to achieve my goals was me. Rusty is someone you might want to get to know. Part 1. Put aside limited thinking. One of the leadership principles I write about is called Believe in Others. What I don't mention is that it also means believe in yourself. Rusty explains what someone said to him that helped him make that shift to really believing in himself. Here's Rusty.
Towards the end of my 14 years that I spent working at Apple, I knew I was ready to go on and do something different. Much of my career up until that point had been about progression, climbing the ladder and going on to the next thing. And I knew I no longer wanted to climb the ladder at Apple. I no longer wanted to keep looking for more responsibility and bigger roles and titles. And largely that was just for personal reasons, that I was happy with my life the way it was, and I didn't want to devote more time and energy towards work. But I had this belief that I still wanted to have rewarding work. Do work that was interesting and challenging, but do that in a way that did not require more and more of my time and energy. I had no idea how to find that place, though. The only model that existed in my head was more responsibility and challenging work meant more time and energy devoted to it. So I spent a number of years looking for other opportunities, mostly looking for other tech companies, looking for other roles in finance, which is what I had been doing at the time. I really kept coming up short because I found other opportunities. I even had some opportunities for new jobs, but they seemed more or less like another version of the same thing, a change of scenery, but not a fundamental change in the work I was doing. And that's not what I was looking for.
Gotcha.
It was at that time that I listened to a speaker. Her name was Felicia Searcy. It was a very short talk. It was about 20 minutes long. And inside of that 20 minutes, she gave me an idea that I acted on, and it changed the direction of my life. And what she asked me to do was something that I'd actually never done before. It was just to imagine what it is that I really wanted to be doing, how I wanted to be spending my time. If you think about, you spend half of your waking hours at work for the most part, that's a lot. You want to invest that time and energy in something that's meaningful. All of my questions had always been about what can I do? What am I qualified to do? How can I leverage my past experience? Who do I know? Those kinds of questions. And she said, forget all of the constraints. Don't worry about who you know. Don't worry about what other people will think. Don't worry about how much money you make. Don't worry about what you've done in the past. Don't worry about if you're qualified or not. Put aside all of the reasons, all of the excuses, all of the limitations that constrain you and limit your thinking. Think extravagantly. If you could be spending your time and energy doing something that is rewarding and exciting to you, what would that be? In that moment that I got the idea of becoming a coach, although it didn't start that way. It actually started as talking to people about things that matter to them and having more meaningful and real conversations with people. That was the first idea. That moved pretty quickly into being a coach as a mechanism, as a way to do that. But it all happened inside that 20-minute talk. I had been looking for years. I'd been scratching my head and interviewing and looking at other jobs and not making progress. And inside of 20 minutes, by putting aside constraints and thinking broadly and really just tuning into what would I really love to do if I could do that in a way that would be so marvelous and rewarding that I would almost want to pinch myself and say, is this real? Could I really do that? And thinking about it in that way gave me this idea that changed the direction of my life.
You said you spent 14 years at Apple. During that time, I would guess you have spent a fair amount of time coaching and mentoring other people to where doing this externally as an independent coach is a natural progression for you.
You're right. I did spend a lot of time coaching and mentoring people. And I will say, after that 20-minute talk, my mindset shifted. And my mindset shifted from working within the constraints that I thought were put on me, which was, I've got a certain education, a certain background, I know certain people, trying to work within those constraints. My mindset really shifted to challenge the constraints, to look beyond them and to help other people look beyond them and say, what does success really look like for you in your role, in your life, in terms of the work-life balance that you have? Because if you're willing to put a stake in the ground and say what's important to you, you can absolutely accomplish it.
I think all of your years working in corporate America has really helped you and shaped you to the point when you listened to Felicia's talk, you were ready for it.
I was ready for it. And I loved that idea. And, I've always been a dreamer to some extent, but working in the corporate world, there's not a lot of room for that. To me, this idea of being able to accomplish what it is that I really want in my life and someone giving me permission to go define that, explore it, and pursue it. In theory, I wouldn't need permission to do that, but I kind of did because for so many years, I had been conditioned to working inside of the constraints of what I thought my life would look like, working in big companies and fitting in and being effective in those companies.
Organizations are highly structured.
Mm-hmm.
There are constraints in what you can do, what you can't do, but a lot of times some of those constraints are self-imposed.
Yes.
There's an art to navigating where the limits are and how you can shape the role that you're doing and find purpose in what you're doing that's different from the purpose of what your organization is trying to achieve, but purpose might be in helping other people grow and develop, sort of like that. Once you're outside of that, you're able to go back in to help people who are struggling with those constraints that are affecting their thinking and some of the self-limiting constraints. And that's why people need coaches like you.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. I think having that outside perspective is so important because when you're in the midst of it, you don't see it. And I didn't see it when I was in the midst of it at Apple. I just thought that's the way it works. As you said, organizations do have expectations and cultures, and they're strong. It takes an outside perspective to shake that up a little bit and change your viewpoint. But when you do that, all of a sudden you see this whole world of possibility that opens up that wasn't visible to you before. I experienced that just in my career change, but I've worked with plenty of people who experience that without changing their career or even their job. They show up differently to their work. They make different decisions. They're more themselves. They're more authentic. They bring their humor, they bring their challenging perspectives, and they show up with that in the workforce. And all of a sudden, they're happier in their work. They feel much more leeway in terms of the decisions they're making. Maybe surprisingly, but maybe not, they're more effective. That's the thing I just think is so magical, is if you can bust out of this mold of this is what's expected of me and I have to show up this way, and you can start being more yourself and being more authentic, not only are you happier, but you're more effective and you do have a bigger impact in your work.
Wow. You just described, in a sense, the difference between managing, if you're at that level, and practicing leadership in a manager's role. I think the outcomes that are the performance really goes up. Like you said, people who really show up differently, they're happier, they're better off, and the people that they work with are happier and better off.
Absolutely. And I've been on this quest myself to be more and more myself. I used to, if you had talked to me 10 years ago, there would be the home version of Rusty in my personality, and then there would be the work version. And the work version was more buttoned up, more formal. Even the way I dressed was different. And over time, especially as a coach, I've just really worked on integrating those just to be more and more me. in every interaction, whether I'm in a coaching call, whether I'm talking to a potential client, whether I'm interacting with my wife or my son or my friends, to bring me as I am, my authentic self, rather than saying, well, I've got to put on a certain personality or show up in a certain way, behave in a certain way to be successful in the work environment. Breaking through that little barrier right there is a great opportunity to start to show up more authentically. And ultimately, that's what we all want in our leaders, right? When you think about the leaders who you like and respect the most, you have a sense of who they are as a person. They're not pretending to be something, they're them. It's that connection that really makes them a good leader.
You've heard the phrase work-life balance.
Of course.
I think the phrase work-life imbalance is when you try to compartmentalize your at work and away from work as two separate things. I think that when you do that, there's some tension or incongruency with who you are as a person. And it sounds like you were able to overcome that and develop a balance that is more, I'm blanking on a word for it.
Well, it's easier to navigate, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly what the right word is, but my experience is it is easier to navigate when I feel like I'm not compartmentalizing as much. And towards the end of my time at Apple, I was doing that. I was more relaxed. I was more willing to bring some humor into the workplace, to be a little bit more of myself, to talk about the things, my interest outside of work, in the chit chat and so on that happens in between meetings and bumping into people in the hallway. I just became more me. And that made the whole process, as you described, of navigating work and personal life easier, because it wasn't like I was changing clothes in between every time I moved back and forth. It was just me. So there wasn't this switching cost. Compartmentalizing makes work-life balance hard.
People think of work-life balance as time, how much time you spend at work versus at home. You end up spending too much time working even when you're at home, and that's not it. When your emotional state is the same at both locations, if you're experiencing hardship at home because you have a loved one in the hospital, someone is seriously injured, or there's some emergency that's affecting the way you feel, it's going to affect your work, and vice versa. If you're having a terrible time at work and things aren't going well and you're stressed and you experience anxieties, that's going to carry over to your home.
Yeah.
To get work-life balance, you need to get both of those working together where they're in harmony. A lot of places like Southwest Airlines, in their book Nuts by Freeberg and Freeberg, they talk about this, that when someone has a loved one in the hospital for cancer or whatever, they will go to the hospital, bring flowers. They will contact the employee and say, first of all, do not come back to work. Stay with your partner, spouse, or whatever. And we want you to take care of yourself, because you're not going to be at your best when you're at work, knowing that you have a loved one in the hospital.
Yeah, absolutely. It's what a unique and responsible and humane way to interact with people and to treat people.
Part 2, change how you think about problems. Leadership is about helping others develop mentally and morally. One way of doing that is getting them to look at problems and opportunities from a different perspective. In this story, Rusty talks about a vice president who did just that. Once again, here's Rusty.
When I joined Apple in 2005, it was before the iPhone had been announced or released. The hottest product that Apple had at that day was the iPod, but I happened to be responsible for the computers. I was in the operations group, in the supply chain group. And one of the key metrics that we were responsible for was the percentage of orders that shipped out on time to our customers. There was a particular focus on our individual customers as opposed to retailers like Best Buy. Of course, we wanted to get their product on time as well, but it was really a focus for individuals, you or me or anybody else who placed an order on apple.com and they expected their product to ship out. So we measured that. When I started, this was just one of the multiple ways that they assessed the success of the team. So I was responsible for the laptops and making sure that they shipped out on time. And our target was 95% of the time, you want the orders to go out on time to consumers. Seems great, but it was one of those metrics that was there and we were responsible for, but it wasn't something we ever really put a lot of focus on. but you didn't want to get on the radar screen because then you'd get attention that you didn't want.
Yeah.
So it was more trying to avoid trouble than it was trying to really generate success. And that was the mentality that we had for quite a while. And then one day, the VP of the organization, her name is Deirdre, she stood up and said, hey, we take a lot of orders from customers online. And if 5% of the time we're late shipping those out, that impacts thousands of customers every day. These are people who place an order and we say we're going to ship it that same day and we don't. Thousands of customers every day are going to be disappointed. That's not good enough. We need to do better. So she raised the target from 95% of the orders shipping on time to 99% of the orders shipping on time. At the time, we were bouncing around plus or minus 95%, but we were not anywhere close to 99%. We didn't know how to do that. But it changed our thinking, first of all, about the customers, right? Because this change, it's not just some number we're measuring. This is actually impacting customers on a day-to-day basis. And secondly, it changed our thinking about what does success look like and how do we pursue success rather than try to avoid failure. Because with the 95% target, it was really more about avoiding failure so that we didn't have to spend a bunch of time explaining ourselves. We changed our whole dynamic to now focus on how do we actually achieve this target that we didn't really know that we could achieve. It seemed like a stretch that we weren't sure we'd be able to hit. But we got the right teams together. We spent time on it. We've mapped out the process. We understood more deeply how this is being measured, what qualifies as shipping out on time and what the total number of orders are, the denominator in that number, so that we could understand it and we could really drive towards hitting the target. And within a year, we did hit the target. I recall that experience because of a couple of things. One is it changed our thinking about the customer so that we really thought about the impact that what we're doing on a daily basis has a real impact on customers. But it also helped shift from more of a defensive approach to more of an offensive approach. Defensive, just trying to manage this 95% target and stay off the radar, to an offensive approach saying, hey, we want to score here. We want to do better by our customers. We want to have higher level of performance. We may not know how to do it. We may not even be sure we can do it, but it changed our whole thinking about it and engaged everybody on the team in a different way. And we achieved a degree of success that we had not ever achieved before, and we weren't even sure we would be able to.
When your purpose is to avoid notice, avoid pain, avoid those types of talks, it's not a very strong purpose. But when you make that shift, like you were talking about, and you describe it as defense to offense, where you're really focused on the customer and you want them to have a great experience, your purpose changes in such a way that it affects your performance.
Absolutely. And I love the way you said that, Gary, is when your purpose is to avoid pain is not very motivating. It's the truth. To me, it just raised this whole question of, what is the purpose? What are you working towards in your role? And this was not my whole job. This was a portion of what I did, and not a huge portion even. But I remember it because it was such a mindset shift and it changed my whole attitude about it. Now, instead of this thing, avoiding pain, like nobody likes pain, so you're just avoiding it. Now it became interesting. It became a problem to solve. I was curious about it. I like challenges. I like solving problems. Great. Let's go figure this thing out.
And that's when innovation happens and creativity. When you have that curiosity and you look at the challenge in a whole different way versus, oh, good, we hit our 95%. No one's going to say anything.
Yeah. And what I think is so interesting, you're right on that it brings creativity and innovation. And what's so interesting to me is that the fundamental problem never changed and the fundamental goal never changed. The goal was always to ship orders to customers on time. That never changed. But the way we thought about it, the way we talked about it, the way we measured it, the way we related to it changed. And there's such a great lesson in that for me, which is, first of all, be willing to set a stretch target. We didn't know we could hit it. We didn't have any justification for it, but that's what the VP challenged us with. And so we went off to do it. Be willing to set the stretch. And then second of all, think about if there's any area in your work or your life where you've got this kind of pain avoidance mentality, trying to manage the downside. Just ask, is there another perspective there? Is there another way to think about it? Because I love the way you talked about that, Gary, as to when you bring creativity and innovation because you're forward-looking or offensive, as the way I described it, it's such a better way to relate to your work. It's so much more energizing and fulfilling personally, and you do better work. It's a win-win.
I think about basketball. I know that's odd, just to throw it out there. This reminds me of basketball, but it does in this sense. If you are playing basketball, You see that usually there's a scoreboard or someone is keeping score. So you know if you're up or down compared to the score of the other team. Imagine if you're playing basketball and no one kept score. It would be a little bit less interesting, especially if you're just watching the game. It wouldn't have the same effect. I think you're right. I think there's things that we can do, and it can go to medical in monitoring pain. There are things that we can do to make it not enjoyable, but make it more creative and change your approach just by thinking about it differently. I think what you've tapped into is something powerful.
Yeah, Gary, you're so right. And the other part that I think that is important is about keeping score. The score reflects something important. I'm reminded of a conversation I had with my friend Dan, who was telling me that at his company, they had to keep track of how they were allocating their time and how they were spending their time. One of the metrics was what percentage of people have reported their time within the last week or last month. That kind of metric, to me, is a pain avoidance kind of metric. You don't want to be on the list because you don't want to be called out for it. But what is the real value in reporting your time? Through this conversation that I had with Dan, one of the things we talked about was finding a good reason to report his time, because he bristled at it. He said, I don't want to report my time just because they're asking me. It's some corporate policy. And it just seems stupid. It seems like a waste of my energy to try to track my time and report it. But when he started to shift that differently and say, how can actually reporting my time be correlated to the impact I'm having with the clients that I'm serving, so that my boss and the people around me understand, hey, by allocating my time in this way, I'm generating these kinds of results and having this kind of impact on my clients, which helps the clients, it helps us as a business, and it reflects on his quality of work. And when he could think about it that way, there was a good reason to keep score, and he was more motivated to do it. I go back to I totally agree keeping score can be useful, but it's important to connect that score to something that matters.
Yes.
It's not just, because in the corporate world, I've lived in it. There's always stuff that you question and scratch your head. Why are we doing this? And why are we being measured on this thing? It kind of becomes this corporate hamster wheel that you can run around. That's not very productive. So finding a different way to keep track of it and to connect it to something that actually matters, that moves the needle for the business, for the customers, in the world, for yourself, that's where it can actually, I think, become really powerful.
I think you're spot on. There's so many times measures are taken for a specific reason, but then things happen like technology changes where those metrics become meaningless, but you still keep doing it because that's what you've always done. Just like you said, someone asks, why are we doing this? It doesn't make sense. And no one knows because all the people that were there at the beginning may have moved on to different roles or different jobs, and no one really understands what happened.
And yeah, it's such a funny aspect of culture and human behavior that we learn something and we just tend to keep doing it because that's what I've always done.
Yeah, exactly. So the messages or the red flag might be the word, but maybe that's a little bit too dramatic. When someone says, but that's how we've always done it, that should capture your attention and say, oh, really? Well, let's find out why. Let's think through this,
Yeah, that was always an area that piqued my interest when I worked in the corporate world. Anytime I heard that, that's how we've always done it, was always raised an automatic question. But does it make sense? Does that still make sense today, given the environment that we're in?
One advantage you have that many people who are consultants don't necessarily have is a lot of internal corporate experience. When you've had that and you're on the outside, now you have two perspectives that you can tie together that gives you a lot more insight. And like you were saying earlier, that helps the people on the inside learn what they cannot see. And you're able to see things that they don't.
Yeah. I thank you for saying that. And I acknowledge and I recognize the value of having spent so many years in the corporate world and now stepping outside of it. Absolutely. I always appreciated Dilbert, but I have a whole new appreciation for Dilbert now that I sit outside of the corporate world, because it's, when you're in it, yes, you can kind of laugh and chuckle, but it's your life.
Yeah.
And now sitting outside of it, I can see the absurdity of some of it. And obviously many corporations do wonderful things and work well and all of that. So I'm not trying to disparage the corporate world in general, but it certainly has its idiosyncrasies.
Oh, it's true. I've applied for a few corporate jobs, but the response has been, you're a consultant, you're on the outside. if you came in, you're going to end up leaving again. Well, yeah, eventually, but
Right.
it's like, no, we want people that have the frame of mind that will be compliant, So
Mhm.
it's really interesting.
That's pretty interesting that that's an explicit desire on their part as they're hiring. We want compliant people.
Yeah, it goes back to diversity.
Hmm.
We could have a diverse group from different nationalities, genders, sexual orientation, religion, etc. But if you did a study of their thinking, you might find that their thinking is very similar. You don't have neurodiversity, even though you have physical diversity.
Yeah.
When we hire, we try to hire people who think like us, but hiring someone who is different is high risk.
Interesting. Yeah. I think that notion of how is hiring done? How is promotion done? I find that very interesting.
Part 3, Envision Success. Some of the results of practicing leadership are improved work environment, increased feelings of safety among teammates, increased mental and moral capabilities, especially creativity, innovation, and learning. One particular result is worth noting, and that's removed or reduced barriers. Rusty advises us in a way that relates to this removed or reduced barriers concept. Here's Rusty.
My advice for leadership is to step away from your day-to-day and give yourself a little bit of space. Ask yourself, in the absence of constraints, if you didn't have to worry about whether your boss likes what your decision is, or your family likes what your decision is, or what people will think about you, or how much money you make, or any of those things, if you can put away all the constraints and just imagine a degree of success, both for you and for the work that you're doing and the work that you're leading, what would that be? I want to connect that to, part one, the talk that I heard where someone challenged me to do that. But it's also related to the story I shared in part 2 about changing the performance metric from 95% to 99%. That kind of came out of the blue. It seems logical in retrospect, but for all of those of us at the time, it didn't. It seemed like a surprise. But how do you give yourself the space in order to come up with ideas like that and the freedom to come up with ideas like that? And I think there's 2 key ingredients. One is you need distance from what you're in the middle of. If you're trying to do this while you're sitting in your office, if you're trying to do this in the 7 minutes that you have between meetings, those are not very conducive times for this kind of thinking.
Yeah, not going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. It's not going to happen. You need to create some space, go for a walk, go sit on the couch for 10 minutes, but you need to create some physical and mental space, first of all. And then the second part is to get creative and use your imagination and just think, what does a whole new degree of success look like for you in your work and for your work, and for you personally and for the team at large? Get creative about that. In my personal case, that ended up in a career shift. In the example I used for my time at Apple, it resulted in thousands of customers having their orders shipped on time and not being disappointed. There can be great results that come out of this for you, for your team, for your business, but it requires the space to think about it. And it requires the willingness to think creatively, to think expansively, to think out of the box, to be willing to explore those things and consider them, and then ultimately settle on a vision and a direction for yourself and for your business that lights you up, that you're excited about, and you're ready to go lead.
The way you first started talking about that was kind of at the macro level, like big picture kind of a thing. But then you shifted it to the daily level. And it would be so amazing if in the mornings, at the end of the day, even in the middle of the day, taking some time to say, okay, how was yesterday? What happened this morning if you're doing it at lunch or at the end of the day? And then just assessing and thinking about it. If you get that distance, like you said, the first thing, and you allow the right amount of time without interruption, amazing things can happen.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. I'll just give you a little personal confession here that those kind of daily check-ins I think are so valuable, and I'm just not good at them. I've yet to find the discipline at doing that really well. And so, for me, I aim for weekly, but I think, having those periodic kind of macro level check-ins with yourself. A couple of weeks ago, I was on spring break and I was with my son in the Grand Canyon.
Oh, wow. Nice.
It was beautiful. And what a wonderful place to have grand thinking, to take a step back and to be inspired by the natural beauty and allow that inspiration to carry over into my thinking and to think about what's next for me and where do I want to go. I think those kinds of moments can be very inspiring, obviously, but from the surrounding in the Grand Canyon, but also the internal moment can be inspiring to get those ideas. And then it's those check-ins, daily, weekly, whatever you can manage to do, that helps you stay on track towards making progress towards it.
My thanks to Rusty Gaillard. If you'd like to learn more about Rusty, go to the show notes. I'd like to thank you for listening. This is Gary DePaul. Until next time, lead on.